If you ask Jehovah's Witnesses about their problems with child abuse, they will likely always minimize it, telling you that the issues boil down to a few bad apples that you'll find in any organization. The truth, however, is quite more sinister.
Pennsylvania Attorney General announcing charges against 5 men for allegedly sexually abusing children for years. All of them were members of the Jehovah's Witnesses Church.
Aged 8, she reported it to church elders, those in charge of governing and disciplining the congregation.
Part of an ongoing investigation against multiple men across Pennsylvania for sexually assaulting children.
The leadership is knowingly protecting the identities of pedophiles.
The elders in this congregation did not call the police.
Neighbor, it'd be best if you go ahead and leave.
The Jehovah's Witnesses have an industrial issue with child abuse that revolves around not a few bad apples, but around how they treat and protect abusers. When child abuse happens in real life, you know that you are supposed to call the police immediately. That's not what you're instructed to do when you're a Jehovah's Witness. Instead, when that happens inside the religion, the followers are instructed to report the issue to the elders and then be patient about it.
Say, for example, you become aware or you become the victim of an injustice in the congregation. The elders have been informed. Now what? Now patience. These things take time to be resolved properly as per Jehovah's arrangement. And we don't take things back into our own hands because it takes time. We want to give Jehovah's arrangements a chance, right? And once it's done properly, it's always for everybody's good, for the greatest good of all.
The elders will immediately start documenting everything they know about this case and are instructed to call not to the police, but to their local Bethel branch. Bethel is like the central offices of the cult, and every congregation is assigned to a branch of it. Their call will be answered by a person who will remain anonymous and whose main job is to verify whether or not they can get away in the current location without reporting it to the police, using any kind of clergy privilege they can use to avoid reporting, which happens in most cases, but I'm getting ahead of myself. They will then start a judicial committee, a group of 3 or 4 elders, pastors of a congregation, need to talk to the abuser and the victim in confidence, where the victim has to convince them that the abuse happened. The elders in the judicial committee have absolutely no training when it comes to dealing with victims of abuse, and they will often re-traumatize the victim, asking them to relive the abuse over and over again, questioning it at every turn to see if they're telling the truth. They also have to determine whether or not the abuse was instigated by the victim, and if the victim was also a willing participant, even if they're underage. The judicial committee, if they believe the victim, has to then talk to the abuser, looking for a confession. If they attain a confession from them, they then have to judge the abuser to figure out whether or not they are repentant. At this point, the elders have 2 choices. They can rule that the abuser was repentant, or they can rule that they weren't. If the abuser wasn't repentant, then they get disfellowshipped and shunned by the religion. If the abuser was repentant, then they get punished with not being able to do as much in the congregation for a while, and the victim has to forgive them, attending meetings with them twice a week, and considering them a brother or sister. In none of those circumstances will the elders ever call the police. However, remember how the victim can be determined to be a willing participant? If that happens, then the victim can be disfellowshipped and shunned by the religion, their friends and their family included, while the abuser may even remain in the congregation. This makes it so the abuser has all the chances to not get reported to the authorities. The Jehovah's Witnesses will always say that the parents have the absolute right to report it to the police, but this is a dog whistle. The parents are only told that they have the right to report it to the police, but they're never encouraged to do so. On the contrary, they're often encouraged not to do so, as to not bring reproach to Jehovah's name, aka not damaging the public face of the religion. Jehovah's Witnesses are constantly told that they shouldn't exercise their rights if that could damage their religion's image in any way.
What about in an area where we have a scriptural right to do something? Now, surely exercising that right, if it stumbles someone, we can't be held accountable for that, can we? Well, open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. It says, "But keep watching that your right to choose does not somehow become a stumbling block to those who are weak." Isn't that interesting? Even our right to choose, if it would stumble someone, we wouldn't exercise that right according to this scripture.
The elders get away with not reporting it to the authorities because they misuse clergy privileges, where if you confess to a member of the clergy in private, the clergy is exempt from reporting it to the police. Now, you can think that this is either right or wrong, but it doesn't matter, because that's not how it works inside of the Jehovah's Witness religion. As I mentioned, usually the abuser will confess to a body of elders, 3 or 4, where the legal department will also be informed about the abuser. When Jehovah's Witnesses confess their crimes, they're not confessing it to a lone person this one time in confidence. They confess it to a wide network composed of people they often won't ever know. Now, what happens if there's a report of abuse, the elders confront the abuser, and the abuser doesn't confess? Nothing. Nothing happens. The Jehovah's Witnesses follow what they call the two-witness rule, which means that every matter has to have either a confession or 2 witnesses to be resolved.
Now, there's something that the apostates are talking about and trying to put forward. The media has picked it up. Others have also picked it up. And that is our scriptural position of having 2 witnesses a requirement for judicial action if there's no confession. Jesus establishes the fact that there has to be 2 witnesses. Now, it doesn't mean that if there's only 1 witness, that there's no consequences. There might be, depending upon the situation. But the scriptures are very clear. Before a judicial committee can be convened, there has to be a confession or 2 witnesses. So we will never change our scriptural position on that subject.
Since abusers don't usually like to have witnesses, this is extremely hard to accomplish. The elders will, of course, record that case of abuse in the Jehovah's Witnesses file at the branch, but other than that, they won't do anything. Recently, they tweaked the rules so if another victim comes forward, they also count as a second witness. But this is a recent tweak, and it still leaves elders room to determine that one of the victims isn't reliable, and therefore can't do anything about it. All of this was carefully documented by the Australian Royal Commission in 2015, where they looked into the religion's policies to handle child abuse. And what they uncovered was frightening. They started with the testimony of BCB, a woman who was abused by an elder of her congregation repeatedly when she was a child, with no repercussions other than having to say "I'm sorry" after BCB asked for help. BCB was also encouraged not to report the abuse to the Australian Royal Commission because that could besmirch Jehovah's name. When the elders were confronted about it, they admitted to destroying all of the evidence and the notes they had, so the congregation never had to find out about it, as it's common to do, and passionately argued that it is in their responsibility to protect children.
Your decision on whether or not to disfellowship someone, you don't take consideration of children outside of the congregation.
Do take consideration of them, but what ability have we got to protect every child in Australia?
Well, what you can do is you can report to the child protection authorities.
And that is done in some cases.
But generally it's not done, is it?
No.
It's not done unless there's a legal requirement for it to be done, is there?
That is true.
They also examined the case of another victim, BCG, who was abused by her father, an elder in the congregation. And when her younger sisters came out to say that he was abusing of them too, their testimony was dismissed because they were considered to be too young to know what they were talking about. At the end, the father was disfellowshipped, but not for her abuse, because they still lacked 2 witnesses to validate that event. When an elder told BCG that her father was about to be readmitted in congregation, BCG said that she would warn the police because the congregation wasn't safe, and the elder threatened to disfellowship her for bringing reproach on Jehovah's name. One of the elders interviewed by the Australian Royal Commission said that he'd received 3 or 4 abuse allegations every month. Then, the Royal Commission managed to interview Jeffrey Jackson, member of the governing body, the leaders of the religion, who happened to be in Australia at the time. And his testimony is one of the most misleading and obtuse testimonies I have ever seen, often reinventing the questions and avoiding them answering them directly, and sometimes even lying directly.
Does the governing body, or do the members of the governing body, do you see yourselves as modern-day disciples, the modern-day equivalent of Jesus' disciples?
We certainly hope to follow Jesus and be his disciples.
And do you see yourselves as Jehovah God's spokespeople on earth?
That, I think, would seem to be quite presumptuous to say that we are the only spokesperson that God is using. The scriptures clearly show that someone can act in harmony with God's Spirit in giving comfort and help in the congregations.
Does your church accept corporal punishment of children?
Our church accepts the family arrangement and expects that parents have the responsibility to discipline and raise their children.
That doesn't answer my question. Do you accept corporal punishment?
In our literature, I think you'll see time and time again, we've endeavoured to explain that here, discipline is referring to more a mental point of view.
I regret to tell you, you're still not answering my question. Do you accept corporal punishment?
No.
You don't?
Not personally, no. And not as an organisation. We don't encourage it.
But do you prohibit it?
Our literature has pointed out that the true way to discipline children is by educating them, not giving corporal punishment. Your Honour, I can only tell you the spirit behind our writings. I do understand.
Could women be involved in the determination of whether or not the allegation is true?
Well, Your Honour, if I could say, I think they already are involved.
Not in the decision, Mr. Jackson. Please address my question.
Otherwise, how would the elders know what the facts are?
Mr. Jackson, you're not dealing with my question.
I'm sorry, I apologise.
Would you like me to put it again? Would you like me to put it again?
If you would, please.
For example, if they had become inactive or sought to fade without formally dissociating, and the elders came to visit and found them celebrating Christmas or a birthday, they would be found to be in transgression of the rules, would they not?
That is not my understanding, but again, as I said, it's not my field. That goes into policy with regard to those type of things. But from my personal experience, that's not the case.
Well, Mr. you say it's not your field, but you remember the governing body, which is responsible, as you've said, for the whole field, and you've been a member for 10 years, and all the committees are responsible to and accountable to the governing body. So
that is correct.
So it is your field, isn't it?
When faced with the reality that women may feel more inclined to talk about their abuse if women were allowed to form a part of the judicial committee, Jackson dismissed the idea.
I was wondering whether you could have a structure which meant that the judicial decision as to whether or not the allegation was true could be determined by a body capable of having women represented on it, and that body's decision would then be taken to the elders in relation to decisions to disfellowship. Do you understand?
I understand that, Your Honour.
Well, is it possible to make that change?
It is possible to make sure that elders are fully aware of the whole story. But for women to be elders in the congregation, that is not possible.
No, Mr. Jackson, I wasn't asking you that.
He also showed his ignorance in the Bible by saying that the Bible doesn't allow women to judge. And Angus Stewart had to remind him that that's not correct. talking about the example of the prophetess Deborah in the book of Acts, who took judicial actions. Finally, he was asked about their policies of disassociation, where victims lack the opportunity to leave the religion after their abuse, because anyone who leaves the religion is shunned by the religion, family and friends included, which Jackson continued giving misleading and outright false answers. He did at least admit that the religion has issues with child abuse and that those issues stem from their policies.
But do you accept that the Jehovah's Witness organization has a problem with child abuse amongst its members?
I accept that child abuse is a problem right throughout the community, and it's something that we've had to deal with as well.
And do you accept that it's presented, I withdraw that, do you accept that the manner in which your organization has dealt with allegations of child sexual abuse has also presented problems?
There have been changes in policies over the last 20 or 30 years where we've tried to address some of those problem areas, and by the fact that we've changed the policy would indicate that the original policies weren't perfect.
They also went into deep detail about how the allegations of abuse are handled and documented, and uncovered where they are documented. The Jehovah's Witnesses compile everything into a giant database of abusers that they keep confidential. How large? Well, the Royal Commission got hold of over 5,000 documents relating to 1,006 cases of child abusers since the 1950s, which is when they started documenting these cases. And in over half of them, the perpetrator had confessed. Now, as we said, if you ask the witness, they will always tell you that the parents have the absolute right to report it to the authorities. If that's the case, how many of these cases do you think got reported to the police? Most of them? Half of them? Maybe at least 10%? Zero. Cases were ever reported to the police. This isn't just a giant coincidence where everyone just so happened to not have the time to police to file a report. This proves that when they claim that the victims have the right to report it to the police, this is only a dog whistle for having a right, but not exercising it to save Jehovah's name. But let's take the documents in Australia as a sample. To get an idea of the scale of the abuse, we need to know how many Jehovah's Witnesses there have been in Australia since the 1950s. According to the 1950s yearbook, there were 3,774 publishers in 1950. We know that in 1983, there were 33,982. And we also know that now they have 67,700, according to jw.org. Now, let's assume that these numbers represent 3 different independent generations of Jehovah's Witnesses to bulk up the numbers and get to a very conservative number of 105,456. For the sake of convenience, let's simply round it down to 100,000. We can say that in Australia, since the 1950s, there has been roughly around 100,000 witnesses. If they have also had 1,006 people, that means that 1% of their followers are known child abusers. For the longest time, congregations were composed of roughly 100 people, making it so statistically there's a PDF file in every congregation. If this is representative of the religion, that means that now, with over 8 million members, the religion is hiding 80,000 known abusers around the world. It knows of a lot more who have long died, and statistically, none of them have been reported to the police. This is a gigantic issue, far bigger proportionally speaking than the Catholic Church's issue with abuse. After all, their issue was only with 4% of clergymen. But Jehovah's Witnesses have a rate of 1%, not of clergymen, but of the members of the religion in general, which include men, women, and children. If statistically there is one known abuser per congregation, then that means that practically every child who is in the Jehovah's Witness is exposed to a predator, especially if they're isolated with other people, like when they go preach door to door and they're assigned a random partner from the congregation. These are very conservative estimates that anyone can easily calculate if they take the information about the Australian Royal Commission, which you can check for free in the description. There are potentially over 100,000 1,000 cases of child abuse that the religion has carefully documented and stashed away for nobody but them to see. And who knows how many of those abusers also abuse kids outside of the religion who wouldn't have suffered if the religion had done its job and reported them to the police. And that's the main issue with child abuse. The Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses view those cases not as crimes that should be immediately reported to the police, but as PR issues that must be controlled and silenced to protect the image of the religion. And the religion is currently holding a gigantic database with thousands of abusers hostage, choosing to hide those crimes every day instead of giving them to the authorities. Statistically, every single congregation has carefully documented every single case of abuse and has filed them all at the local branch, where they all have centralized the information, and at the local congregation. That's right, every single kingdom hall around the world is statistically holding inside at least one case of child abuse, carefully documented and kept in a file cabinet under lock right there. This religion protects abusers at every turn, needing 2 witnesses or a confession to even take action against the abuser, re-traumatizing victims with the whole process, and making sure the abuser is, at best, simply kicked out of the congregation, and at worst, kept in the congregation next to their victims for years to come, while keeping detailed reports of abuse and making sure that none of what I just said is ever reported to the authorities. At best, the Jehovah's Witnesses may kick the abuser out of the congregation temporarily. At worst, nothing is done, which is what always seems to happen. So what can we do about it? Well, the only thing we can do is to share the facts so people know what the Jehovah's Witnesses are hiding. It's worth noting that your average Jehovah's Witness won't know about this, even if they've experienced abuse from the system, because they're made to think that these are isolated cases that never happen, when in fact they happen all the time. The best way to stop this, however, is to get involved with your local politics to inform them of what's happening in the local congregation, and ensure mandatory reporting laws in your area don't have clergy exceptions, and motivate and support journalists to look into this issue. This is a massive issue that has the capability of changing how the world sees the Jehovah's Witnesses from the ground up. And it honestly blows my mind that this hasn't exploded already, because it involves practically every congregation to some extent, including your local congregation. And lastly, ask your congressperson or whoever your representative is to not have the Jehovah's Witnesses as a charity. This organization has an unspeakable amount of abusers hidden. The least you can do is ensure that you aren't helping them with your taxes.